a forgotten frame, an etched clue, a secret no one dares name. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Michael. This story's for curious minds. Drop a comment and share where you're listening from. Your messages always bring a smile. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. It was the sort of afternoon that the village of Fernwood prided itself on. Honeyed sunlight falling across stone cottages, bees fussing about lavender hedges, and teacups clinking in synchrony with gossip too mild to offend. The annual Summer Sketches exhibition had drawn a modest crowd to the village green, where amateur watercolors on the sun-drenched barns and fluttering foxgloves were affixed to string with humble wooden pegs. Children chased one another between the trestle tables, and a thin line of bunting fluttered like hesitant applause between two elm trees. Miss Jane Marple, seated primly beneath a striped parasol, was sipping her tea with quiet amusement. She wore her customary dove-grey lace gloves, and her pale blue hat was pinned with such precision that not a breath of wind had dared disturb it. She was ostensibly admiring a poorly proportioned landscape of Fernwood Lane, but her eyes had long since shifted to the more intriguing picture of human behavior playing out nearby. Young Marjorie Blaine, nervy and overdressed for the warmth, was whispering urgently to the vicar's wife, while her fiancé, Bernard Timpson, rosy-faced and fidgeting with his cuff, hovered uneasily nearby. 2 seats over, Mrs. Dunthorpe, that bastion of Fernwood propriety, was already remarking to anyone who would listen that someone had certainly brought shop-bought jam to the scone competition, and wasn't that a shame? No one could have guessed the day would end in tragedy. The commotion began just after 3 o'clock, when elderly Mr. Peregrine North, retired solicitor and self-proclaimed art critic, failed to appear to collect his winning ribbon. His painting, a rather severe oil portrait of his late wife, encased in a heavy pewter frame, had drawn curious murmurs for its unusually somber tone. He'd submitted it last minute, as was his way, with the vague air of having done someone a favor. "Do you suppose he's fallen asleep somewhere?" asked Mrs. Ridgely, blinking through her bifocals. "He's known for nodding off in his potting shed." "He'd not miss a chance to be admired," huffed Miss Crowley, the postmistress. "Not old North. He's always prattling on about aesthetics and visual legacy." A murmuring crowd formed. When no one could find him in the marquee or among the scone displays, Marjorie Blaine reluctantly fetched Mr. Hartley, the village constable, who, though only mildly alarmed, agreed to check the rooms of the adjacent reading hall, where Mr. North had been seen taking a tea tray not long before. The door was unlocked. Inside, a streak of late sunlight illuminated the dust in the air and the rows of aging books. The air was still too still. On the floor, by the high-backed armchair, lay Mr. North. A delicate china cup lay shattered beside him, his hand curled unnaturally, stretched toward the fallen tea tray. "Dead," Hartley said quietly, kneeling to check. "Stone cold." By the time the village doctor confirmed some faint suggestion of poison, though further tests would be required, the summer air had curdled into something brittle. The villagers began clustering in stiff, whispering knots. The mayor arrived, red-faced and already perspiring. Someone summoned the county authorities. The art exhibition was promptly closed, its cheerful bunting hanging limp and awkward above the scene of death. Miss Marple remained seated for quite some time, her expression unreadable. She had not moved when the constable passed by again and asked gently if she would prefer to head home. "Oh no," she said, folding her gloves with practiced precision. "Not quite yet. You see, I find people often reveal the most when they think no one is looking. And it's such a curious thing about that pewter frame." "Ma'am?" "It's just that I remember it rather differently." Her gaze lingered a moment longer on the portrait, the pewter frame still hanging in its place, the image of Mrs. North oddly subdued, and then returned calmly to her now cold cup of tea. Somewhere behind her, Mrs. Dunthorpe was already proclaiming it must have been the jam. Miss Marple didn't laugh. She rarely did when something was beginning, and something most certainly was. The morning after the exhibition was a curious blend of silence and songbirds chirping over clattering teacups, whispers behind pulled lace curtains, and a conspicuous absence of clinking from Mr. North's habitual morning stroll, which usually involved his silver-topped walking stick tapping smartly against the cobbles. But Fernwood was not a village to remain still for long, especially not in the wake of such a death. The benches outside Milner's grocery were already occupied before 8:30, where Mrs. Dunthorpe, Mr. Lively the butcher, and Edna Pickering had assembled under the guise of early errands. The shop itself, with its polished brass scales and tins of treacle neatly aligned, became a revolving door of rumor. "Poison, that's what I heard," Edna announced solemnly, her knitted cardigan done up crookedly in her haste to leave the house. "Slipped into his tea, they say." Mrs. Dunthorpe leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave. "And did you notice the portrait? That pewter frame of his had those funny marks near the bottom. Looked like scratches, if you ask me." "Could be he fell," Mr. Lively offered, but was roundly ignored. Outside, the postman, Rupert, pedalled past more slowly than usual. Not because of the weight of his postbag, but due to the open windows at number 4, where Mrs. Tattershaw was already halfway through her second cup of tea and well into her 4th theory. "It's the Blaine girl," she was saying, stirring sugar into a brew she had no intention of drinking. "Marjorie. She's always been tightly wound, and you saw her yesterday and could barely look anyone in the eye. Mark my words, something's not right in that engagement." At the far end of Church Street, inside a small sitting room overlooking the green, Miss Marple had set aside her embroidery in favor of a quiet study of her morning letters. But the missive in her lap remained unopened. Her mind had drifted to Mrs. North's portrait, framed so heavily and yet so lifelessly. There had been something missing, not in the picture, but around it. A detail not easily voiced, but quietly, distinctly out of step. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to leap to conclusions, unlike many of her neighbors, who had built robust narratives in the space of a few waking hours. Rather, she watched as the village laid itself bare, as it always did when something cracked the surface of respectability. Constable Hartley, meanwhile, had spent most of the morning fielding phone calls from villagers with helpful information. He had taken to scribbling down names and addresses with the weary air of a man who knew most of them would be nonsense. But one such name made him pause. "Timpson, Bernard," he read aloud, furrowing his brow. "Fiancé of Miss Marjorie Blaine, works in shipping out at Bramhurst. That's 20 miles by train." He made a note to follow up, then rubbed his eyes. Dr. Rothley's preliminary report had ruled out natural causes. Foreign substances were present in the cup, the note had read, though it would take several days to confirm the exact toxin. The tea, the doctor had remarked, had smelled faintly of almonds. Miss Marple, upon hearing this detail later from her friend Mrs. Haycombe, who had it from the vicar's wife, who had it from the constable's own cousin, simply nodded. Almonds. That was very old-fashioned, almost theatrical. But Miss Marple did not mention it to anyone, nor did she rush to declare her thoughts. Instead, she made a point of visiting the churchyard that afternoon, ostensibly to tidy up her cousin Louisa's plot, but in truth because the path passed directly by the North's gate. The cottage was shut up tight, curtains drawn and gate latched. No sign of anyone coming or going. Mr. North had lived alone since his wife's death 3 years ago. His only companion had been a housekeeper, Mrs. Rundle, who came in the mornings but was absent the day of the exhibition due to a nephew's wedding. It was widely known she disliked modern art and made her opinion of the portrait known in vinegar-toned whispers. Miss Marple paused briefly, her eyes on the window of Mr. North's study. She had been there once, years ago, when he had lent some legal advice to a friend of hers about a disputed will. A tidy room, almost painfully so. But yesterday, she recalled, there had been a disarray, a broken cup, a crooked cushion on the armchair, and that portrait hanging not quite straight. Such things were subtle, almost invisible to those untrained in domestic detail. But Miss Marple had long known that disorder, especially in the house of a meticulous man, was rarely accidental. At the vicarage, Reverend Chudley was meeting with Constable Hartley. The vicar, more flustered than usual, twisted his spectacles as he spoke. It's difficult, you see. Peregrine North was not universally loved in this parish. He was rather sharp, opinionated, quite convinced of his own intellect. Did he have any enemies, Reverend? The vicar hesitated. Well, there was the matter of the sketching club funds. He accused Mrs. Ridgely of misallocating monies, though no proof ever came to light. And last winter, he had some sort of legal dispute with Bernard Timpson's father about a land boundary. Anyone more recent? Hartley pressed. There was a rather unfortunate exchange with young Marjorie Blaine not 3 weeks ago. He made some pointed remarks about her suitability as a bride, I believe. Quite personal. She left in tears, I'm told. Hartley made another note, then thanked the vicar and left. The list of potential motives was growing longer than expected. That evening, the green was eerily still. The portrait had been taken down along with the rest of the exhibition, but the memory of it lingered. The pewter frame, said to be an antique from Mrs. North's family, was locked away now in the evidence room. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the sunset streak orange across the rooftops. Her knitting rested beside her, untouched. A portrait is not always just a painting, she said aloud, though no one was there to hear her. It is what we choose to remember or to forget. In the distance, a door closed with a click that echoed faintly across the green, and the village, for the first time in years, did not feel quite safe. By the time Friday morning arrived, the shock had hardened into a kind of routine. The townspeople of Fernwood, who would, in normal circumstances, be discussing hedgerows, biscuit tins, and the correct temperature for seed storage, now spoke exclusively of Mr. North's demise. Yet even in grief, the rituals of small-town English life continued, albeit with a subtle shift in tone. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was seated at the dining table of Mrs. Haycombe's ivy-covered cottage, a fine china teacup nestled delicately between her hands. Across from her, Mrs. Haycombe, widow of a prominent railway official and proud host of the village's second-largest collection of hand-painted sugar spoons, was buttering a scone with all the gravity of a coroner. "Such a horrible business," she murmured, her eyes narrowed thoughtfully over her spectacles. Of course, one always knew Mr. North had a knack for upsetting people, but to end up like that poisoned. It's practically Victorian. Miss Marple nodded, lifting her cup. It is curious. Poison, you see, requires thought, deliberation. So very different from the heat of a moment. Mrs. Haycombe clucked sympathetically. Yes, and it makes one wonder who might have planned such a thing. You know what people are saying? Miss Marple's smile was serene. People are saying many things, I believe. Well, Mrs. Haycombe leaned forward slightly. It seems Bernard Timpson had words with Mr. North only a week ago. Something about wedding finances. Apparently, Mr. North suggested Marjorie was marrying below her station. Absolutely scandalous. I had heard something along those lines, Miss Marple said mildly, though one might argue that the Timpsons are perfectly respectable. Respectable or not, Bernard's temper is no secret, Mrs. Haycombe continued. I remember during the fete last year someone had rearranged the raffle prizes, and he became quite red-faced about it. Said Miss Marple, setting her cup down. But being temperamental and being capable of murder are rather different things. Outside, the faint sound of church bells marked the half-hour. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with quiet precision. Tell me, did you happen to notice anything peculiar about Mr. North's behavior at the exhibition? Anything out of the ordinary? Mrs. Haycombe pursed her lips. Now that you mention it, he did seem distracted. He hardly commented on the paintings, which is unlike him. Normally, he takes great delight in being disagreeable. Miss Marple gave a small nod, tucking that thought away. And the portrait of his wife? Oh, yes. It was gloomy, dark tones, and that pewter frame. Too heavy, in my opinion. Mrs. North always had a lighter taste. She'd never have chosen something so somber. This last remark hung in the air with unexpected weight. Miss Marple tilted her head. That's rather interesting, don't you think? Before Mrs. Haycombe could answer, a firm knock echoed through the hallway. It was Constable Hartley, looking flushed and faintly apologetic. Beg pardon, Miss Marple. Mrs. Haycombe, but I've been making the rounds. Following up, we're trying to confirm the whereabouts of the exhibition in the afternoon. Well, I was here, Mrs. Haycombe said promptly, helping with the cake judging from noon to 2. Then I left to fetch my parasol. A very sudden cloudburst, you remember. And you, Miss Marple? Hartley asked, flipping open his notepad. I was seated by the tea marquee, she replied, watching the visitors come and go. I stayed until the commotion began. Hartley nodded. We've got reports that Bernard Timpson was seen heading toward the reading hall about 20 minutes before Mr. North was found. No one saw him come out. Were they alone inside? Miss Marple asked, her voice feather-light. Hard to say. It's not a large building, but there are side doors and plenty of nooks. Still, he's agreed to come down for a chat. And Marjorie? Miss Marple inquired. She's proving reluctant. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers paused briefly over the edge of her saucer. Poor girl. Engagement nerves, perhaps. Once, Hartley had taken his leave. Miss Marple stood to go. She made no mention of the thought that had just rooted itself in her mind, but she carried it with her like a needle waiting for its thread. Later that day, she visited the church gardens under the pretext of dropping off a jar of quince jelly. The Reverend Chudley was tending to a patch of late roses and straightened with a groan as she approached. Ah, Miss Marple, quite the week, isn't it? Indeed. I thought you might like something sweet. Homemade quince jelly, homemade. You're too kind. My wife will be delighted. They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, the smell of damp earth and late summer blooms drifting through the hedges. Tell me, Miss Marple said quietly, did Mr. North ever speak of his wife in your sessions? Chudley hesitated. I'm not sure what I should say, though I suppose it matters now. Yes, occasionally. He spoke of her in terms more architectural than emotional. Pillar of virtue and foundation of the home. A very legalistic form of love. I wonder, Miss Marple murmured, did he ever seem haunted? The vicar considered. Not haunted, but perhaps unsettled, as though some unresolved matter remained between them. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sometimes the past refuses to rest, especially when framed too heavily. The vicar looked puzzled, but she had already turned to leave. That evening, Bernard Timpson was seen entering the constabulary office, shoulders squared but eyes darting. He left 40 minutes later, pale and tight-lipped. Rumor had it he'd admitted to a quarrel with Mr. North, but swore he left the hall before anything happened. There were no witnesses to confirm or deny it. And Marjorie? She remained at home, curtains drawn. Her mother, seen pacing the front garden, looked 10 years older in 2 days' time. Inside her own cottage, Miss Marple was arranging flowers. She moved quietly from vase to vase, trimming stems and removing browned petals. One bloomer, a drooping peony, she regarded for a long time before plucking it free and dropping it gently into the bin. I think she said softly to no one at all, "We're missing something." And she was right. By Saturday morning, the storm of gossip in Fernwood had reached its third stage of fatigued speculation. The first wave had been disbelief. The second, moral indignation, and now a kind of weary curiosity pervaded. The portrait of Mrs. North had been removed from the reading hall, the bunting dismantled, and the summer sketches banner folded and boxed away for next year if the village dared to hold it again. Miss Marple, who believed in the restorative powers of schedule and calm, had not changed her morning routine. She rose at 6:30, brewed her tea with measured patience, and sat beside the lace-curtained window of her parlor to read the paper, though the Fernwood Courier contained little that was useful apart from which households were selling jam or in need of a chimney sweep. She had made her decision the night before today. She would pay a visit to Mrs. Rundle, the late Mr. North's housekeeper. Not that Miss Marple expected the woman to offer up some melodramatic confession. She never relied on theatrics, but housekeepers, like gardeners and maids, were the silent archivists of private life, and Miss Marple had long ago observed that those who dusted one's mantelpiece often knew more of a person's soul than their closest friends. Mrs. Rundle lived on the edge of the village in a narrow cottage shaded by a leaning birch tree. Miss Marple found her in the garden, pinning laundry on a rope with short, efficient movements. "Oh," Mrs. Rundle said when she saw her visitor. "Miss Marple, isn't it? You'll be wanting to talk about Mr. North." "Only if you don't mind," Miss Marple said gently. "I thought perhaps you might have a moment." Mrs. Rundle straightened and dusted her hands on her apron. "Better come in, then. Tea? Only if it's no trouble." Inside, the cottage was modest and smelled faintly of linseed soap and chamomile. A lace doily covered the tea table, and a small vase of fading asters stood near the window. Mrs. Rundle poured the tea with practiced hands and sat, eyeing her guest with wariness honed by years of service. "You were away the day of the exhibition?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light and unassuming. "My nephew's wedding in Bramhurst. I left early in the morning and came back the next day. I didn't hear till I stepped off the bus that something had happened." "And how was Mr. North in the days leading up to the exhibition?" Mrs. Rundle paused. "Edgy. He'd been fussing over that portrait for weeks, though he said he didn't paint it himself. Claimed it was an inheritance." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "An inheritance? How curious. It was signed, wasn't it?" "Faintly. It looked like it had been scratched in, barely visible. The kind of thing you see in the corner when you dust the glass. Was he fond of it?" Mrs. Rundle let out a dry chuckle. "It didn't seem so. Said it was ghastly. But it has to be shown," he said. "I asked why, and he said, sometimes things must be seen before they can be buried." Miss Marple didn't reply at once. She let the steam from her cup curl upward between them. "One last thing," she said eventually. "The frame. It was pewter, yes?" Mrs. Rundle nodded. "And heavy. Too heavy for the picture, I always said. He didn't want me touching it after he put it up. Kept it in a locked drawer before that." "A drawer?" "In his desk. Had a little lockbox. They kept other odd things in their letters, like old photographs. Once I caught a glimpse of one woman not unlike Mrs. North, but younger. Something about her eyes." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. "Was there ever any suggestion that Mr. North had regrets? About his wife? Or another?" Mrs. Rundle stood and began to gather the tea things. Miss Marple, he was not a sentimental man. But he was secretive. Cold. That house has too many corners. When Miss Marple returned to the lane, the birch tree whispering in the breeze, she stood for a moment to consider the facts. The frame had been locked away. The painting had not been Mr. North's work. He had referred to it as a kind of burden, a necessity before burial. And then there was the matter of the faint scratches near the base of the frame. She continued her walk and passed by the constabulary, where Constable Hartley was just emerging. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod, "I was hoping to see you." "Oh." "We've received the coroner's preliminary note. Cyanide, delivered through the tea. and we've confirmed that Mr. North prepared the cup himself. Alone. Miss Marple pursed her lips. So the poison must have already been in the teacup or in the milk or sugar, perhaps. Possibly, but here's the odd thing. The sugar bowl on the tea tray had a missing lid, and the contents had been replaced with castor sugar, not cubes as Mr. North preferred. Replaced, Miss Marple echoed. That suggests forethought. Hartley scratched his head. We're also reviewing that frame. It's in the evidence locker. Someone noticed the bottom edge is dented, almost as if it had been pried open at some point. Hollow, perhaps. Hollow, she repeated. You think something was hidden inside? Maybe. We haven't opened it yet. We'll do it with gloves and tools. Don't want to damage anything. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. Let me know what you find, Constable. That frame may be more portrait than the portrait itself. That evening, as dusk fell in pale stripes across the rooftops of Fernwood, Marjorie Blaine ventured out for the first time since the exhibition. She walked alone to the churchyard, clutching a folded shawl tightly around her shoulders. She was seen by Mrs. Pickering, who noted the way Marjorie paused at the North family plot, her back rigid, her head slightly bowed. She stood there for nearly 20 minutes before turning and vanishing into the shadows, her footsteps slow and uncertain. Miss Marple heard of the outing within the hour and did not smile. Instead, she sat back in her chair and whispered a line to herself, one she had once heard an inspector use with great solemnity. Motive is a mirror, but motive, when turned inward, may blind. The village clock struck 8, and somewhere, far from Fernwood's lace-curtained windows and rose-trimmed lawns, a truth waited inside a pewter frame. It was just after 9 on Sunday morning when Constable Hartley, shoulders hunched and brow furrowed, arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep. He carried with him a small satchel and a notebook, both damp at the corners from the early mist that clung stubbornly to the hedgerows. Miss Marple had been expecting him. She answered the door herself, already dressed for church, but with her gloves still tucked into her pocket. "You've opened it, I presume?" she asked softly. Stepping aside, Hartley gave a grim nod. "We did. Just this morning. Bring it with me, though you might want to see it before I make the official report." In the parlor, he laid the satchel on the low table between them and unfastened the leather buckle. With great care, he produced the pewter frame, the one that had encased the portrait of Mrs. North. It was heavier than expected, with a dull sheen and faint etchings along the inner rim. The back panel had been removed and now lay beside it like a broken shell. Inside the hollow recess of the frame, they had found a folded parchment. Not a letter, not a will, but a marriage certificate, decades old, brittle at the edges and faintly yellowed. Miss Marple took it without a word and read. The names were handwritten in faded ink. Peregrine John North and Eleanor Maud Wilton, married in 1919, in Brighton, an unfamiliar name. "Eleanor Maud Wilton," she said aloud, the words soft, like testing the shape of a memory. "Not Margaret North." "No," said Hartley. "That's the thing. Margaret, his known wife, was never Eleanor. A different woman entirely." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. "So he had a wife before Margaret." "Seems that way. Or rather, this was his legal wife, and Margaret may never have known." There was a moment of silence. The mantel clock ticked gently behind them. "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "he kept the certificate hidden but framed the portrait, as ideas if he needed to preserve one and bury the other." Hartley looked uneasy. Why keep the certificate at all? Because it represented something that might destroy his standing, and yet he couldn't quite bring himself to destroy it. Hartley scratched his chin. Could it be blackmail? A possibility. But blackmailers don't usually poison their victims. They extract what they want over time. "No, I believe this is more personal." She set the frame down with care. You said there were etchings. Hartley flipped the frame gently in his hands. On the inner edge, yes. Very faint. We nearly missed it. Heresy just near the base. Miss Marple squinted and her eyes widened just slightly. Initials. E.W., 1921. Likely Eleanor's. She paused, then added more quietly. Do you suppose Margaret North ever saw this frame up close? If she did, said Hartley. She never mentioned it to anyone. But maybe that was the point. Miss Marple stood and moved to the window. Outside, the village stirred in slow preparation for Sunday services, bicycles leaning against hedges, well-brushed coats shaken out, and shoes polished with more attention than piety. She spoke without turning. A hidden marriage, a portrait never meant for display. A housekeeper is forbidden to touch it, and a man like Peregrine North guarded, proud, and so very controlled. Hartley waited. What we need to know, Miss Marple continued, is who else knew, if anyone. That afternoon, Marjorie Blaine appeared at the vicarage unexpectedly. Pale and taut, she had come without a hat, and her gloved hands fidgeted at the seams of her coat. She asked to speak to Mrs. Chudley, who received her kindly in the drawing-room. I don't know what to do, Marjorie said, her voice brittle. Everyone's looking, whispering. Bernard says I should ignore it. But I can't. Then perhaps you should speak, said the vicar's wife, her tone soothing. It's just that Mr. North said something to me a few weeks ago about marriage, about shame. Mrs. Chudley remained still, letting the silence draw more from her visitor. He said there were things one could never undo, that some women never knew they were second. Did you understand what he meant? Marjorie hesitated. I thought he was talking about my parents. My mother was his cousin once removed. There were always tensions. But now I'm not sure. That same evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Reverend Chudley. She asked only one question. Do you recall Eleanor Maud Wilton? The vicar blinked. I've only ever heard the name once. Old records, a registry entry. She lived for a time in Sussex, but vanished from mention shortly after 1922. Vanished? No further address. No parish records after that. It was as if she ceased to exist. Miss Marple nodded, but she did not. She merely became a secret. The vicar's eyes widened. You think she died? Unrecorded? Miss Marple gave no answer, but that night she returned home and opened her small writing desk. From it, she drew out an old diarrhea habit she'd kept since her girlhood. In a delicate hand, she wrote one line under Sunday's date. The dead are not always buried in the churchyard. Down the lane, Bernard Timpson was walking Marjorie home. His hand grazed hers but did not hold it. They moved in silence. The warmth between them had faded since the day of the exhibition. I think we should postpone the wedding, Marjorie said suddenly. Bernard stopped. Because of the whispers? No, she said, her voice thin. Because I need to know who I am before I become someone else's wife. And in a darkened corner of the Fernwood Constabulary, the marriage certificate was placed carefully into evidence beside the frame that had held so many unspoken truths. Fernwood, though quiet on the surface, was beginning to shift beneath the weight of secrets long hidden. And Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting in her lap, watched the sun sink behind the church spire and knew that the real motive, quiet, personal, and dangerously human, was drawing ever closer to the light. By Monday afternoon, the atmosphere in Fernwood had settled into an uneasy, calmer, thin layer of propriety, stretched taut over something far more brittle. Church bells still rang, milk still arrived on doorsteps, and the hedges along the green were clipped into symmetrical obedience. But behind net curtains and in the quiet hush of drawing-rooms, the name Eleanor Wilton was beginning to surface like a long-buried pebble in a clear stream. Miss Marple, true to her nature, made no declarations. She asked no direct questions and offered no wild theories. Instead, she paid visits. She listened. She gave advice where it was requested and cups of tea where it was not. It was through this very routine that she found herself seated once more in the conservatory of Mrs. Ridgely, who had unsurprisingly emerged as one of the village's more spirited theorists. "The whole thing's quite unnatural," Mrs. Ridgely declared, folding her lace-mitten hands over her lap. "Poison, secret wives, and that dreadful painting, it's like something from the Penny Dreadfuls." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Yes, it does seem the sort of plot one reads about and never quite believes." Mrs. Ridgely, encouraged by agreement, continued. "And now poor Marjorie's gone pale as chalk. People are whispering that Mr. North threatened her, but I think she knows more than she's saying. There's something in her face like someone who stumbled across a letter not meant for her." "You're very observant," Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea. "Observant? My dear, I live in a village full of predictable people. When someone begins behaving oddly, it stands out like an untied shoelace." At this, Miss Marple's smile lingered a moment longer. "Quite so. Tell me, do you recall when Mr. North first displayed that portrait?" 2 years ago, I believe. He hung it in the study. I remember it distinctly because it was during the Easter bonnet sale and I made a delivery to the house. He showed it off, then called it a piece of historical reckoning. I didn't like the sound of that. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And no one questioned the frame at the time." "Well, I did say it looked dreadfully funereal. He told me it belonged to his wife's family and that sentiment, not taste, had chosen it." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Have you ever met Mrs. North?" "Oh, years ago. Quiet woman, soft-spoken. She hardly attended village events. I thought her nervous, frankly. Or perhaps lonely. She died a long time ago, 3 years now. Cancer, I believe." There was little fuss made. Miss Marple nodded, the pieces beginning to settle in her mind. Not neatly, not yet, but with the uneasy sense that something was being obscured deliberately. And she had learned long ago that in Fernwood, the more delicate the secret, the more elaborate the silence that guarded it. After tea, she wandered to the village green and paused beneath the old oak where Mr. North had once delivered a rather pompous speech about preserving Fernwood's heritage through aesthetics. She remembered well how he gestured too sharply with his cane, how Marjorie Blaine had flinched at his remark about modern youth, and how the vicar had smoothed things over with the practiced ease of a man used to diffusing small fires. And now, it seemed, that fire had become something much darker. Across the green, she noticed Bernard Timpson emerging from the grocer's with a parcel under one arm and a distracted look in his eyes. Miss Marple, never one to intrude but always one to be conveniently present, crossed paths with him just as he reached the pavement. "Mr. Timpson," she greeted warmly. He blinked, then managed a smile. "Miss Marple." "Afternoon. How is Marjorie?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Not herself. She hardly eats. Won't leave the house unless it's dusk. It's like something's taken hold of her, and she's afraid to speak it aloud." Miss Marple nodded gently. Grief does peculiar things, even when we aren't sure what precisely we're grieving. Bernard glanced away, jaw tightening. "She told me something strange. She said Mr. North once mentioned that love, in its purest form, is a prison. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought he was just being his usual dramatic self." "That may well be," Miss Marple replied. "But sometimes people say more than they intend, especially when they believe no one is really listening." Bernard shifted the parcel from one arm to the other. "Do you think Marjorie could have known something about his past?" Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Do you?" He shook his head slowly. "Number, but she's changed since that day, as if she finally understood something he had kept hidden from everyone, and it frightened her." They parted a moment later, and Miss Marple resumed her walk. Her mind was alive with images. A hollow frame, a hidden certificate, a nervous girl, and a veiled reference to a former love. And somewhere among it all, a cup of tea laced with cyanide. She returned home to find a note waiting. It had slipped through her letterbox. Unsigned, written in hurried script on a torn scrap of writing paper. He never painted her. He only copied what he destroyed. Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time. The phrasing was peculiar, almost poetic. The reference to a copy and destruction gnawed at the edge of her thoughts. She rose, crossed to the hearth, and opened the drawer where she kept her scrapbooks. Among the cuttings and funeral notices, she located a small photograph, an old one from the Fernwood archives, taken during a village fete nearly 30 years prior. And there, in the background, just visible beneath the edge of a parasol, was a woman with a tilt to her head and an expression unmistakable in its melancholy grace. It was not Margaret North. Miss Marple leaned closer. The photograph was grainy, the details vague, but the tilt of the chin, the deep eyes, and the necklace that caught the sunlight like a blade matched the portrait precisely. And yet that could not be. Margaret North had not been in Fernwood at the time, but Eleanor Wilton had been. She sat back, heart calm but mind racing. He never painted her, he only copied what he destroyed. A reconstruction, then, a memory given form, framed not in sentiment, but in guilt. Mr. North had preserved the image of Eleanor not to honor her, but to reckon with her. Miss Marple rose and turned down the lamp. The image remained in her mind, long after darkness claimed the village. A pewter frame, a scratched name, and a portrait meant not to remember love, but to conceal a death. The following morning in Fernwood dawned grey and windless. A quiet blanket of stillness lay across the cottages and hedgerows. The village postman delivered his envelopes with a brisk nod. The grocer opened his doors with a yawn, and the chime of the church bell echoed like a reminder that, though the calendar ticked forward, time inside the village had not quite moved on since the murder at the exhibition. At the vicarage, Mrs. Chudley was busy dusting the hymnals when the Reverend came in with a furrowed brow and a folded slip of paper in his hand. "This came addressed to me," he said, voice hushed. Dropped through the letterbox sometime before dawn. She took the paper from him and read the brief message aloud. E.W. was never meant to vanish. He buried her twice, once in silence and again in paint. The handwriting was uneven, as though written in haste or with a trembling hand. "I dare say that confirms it," Mrs. Chudley murmured. Eleanor Wilton was more than just a youthful mistake. She was the central story all along. The vicar gave a slow nod. Miss Marple should see this. And so, within the hour, the note was in her hands. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, eyes scanning the words, then drifting to the small photograph she had left on the table from the night before. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. The portrait, its dark eyes, the faint shadow under the jaw, and the expression tinged with sorrow, were a replication, not painted from life, but from memory, perhaps even from this very photograph or another like it. And the choice of pewter for the frame, with its cold, dull weight, seemed more symbolic now than sentimental. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward her side cabinet. From the drawer, she withdrew a notebook and began writing names, dates, and small notes she had been gathering in the quiet margins of her day. Among them was Eleanor Wilton, married in 1919. No parish record after 1922. Margaret North, married publicly to Mr. North in 1926. Pewter frame, hidden marriage certificate, etchings E.W. 1921. Tea laced with cyanide, delivered by his own hand. Marjorie Blaine. Emotionally shaken, possibly connected by blood. Anonymous notes, one suggesting guilt, the other a cover-up. It was all becoming clear, but clarity was not yet proof. She closed the notebook and made her way to the vicarage. There, after thanking Reverend Chudley for the note, she asked a single question that turned his complexion from calm to alarmed. Have the church records for 1922 to 1925 ever been examined for the name Eleanor Wilton? Specifically, burial or annulment notations? The vicar blinked. We haven't had cause, but I can check the archives. Please do, Miss Marple said gently. I believe you'll find nothing, and that nothing may say quite a lot. Back at her cottage, the afternoon waned. Miss Marple's fingers moved quietly over her knitting, but her eyes remained far away, fixed on the ticking of the mantel clock. And then the knock came. Not heavy, not hurried. A polite, uncertain knock that made her instinctively straighten. She opened the door to find Marjorie Blaine standing there, pale and tentative, her gloves clutched tightly in one hand. Miss Marple, she said, barely above a whisper. May I come in? Of course, my dear. Come. Sit. You look as though you've not had a proper night's rest in some time. Marjorie entered and settled onto the edge of the armchair. She looked around the room as though expecting to see something horrible lurking in the shadows. I've done something wrong, she said. Or maybe I haven't. I don't know anymore. Miss Marple waited. Marjorie pressed the gloves into her lap. Mr. North gave me a letter 2 weeks before he died. Told me it was for me alone. Said it would explain things if I ever needed to understand. And do you still have the letter? Marjorie hesitated. Number I burned it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. I didn't want to, but after he died I couldn't bear the idea of anyone else seeing it. Bernard doesn't know. No one does. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, you should tell me what it said. Marjorie swallowed hard. It said he was not my uncle. He said he had once loved a woman who disappeared from his life, but not from the world. He said she had a child. He never saw her again after something happened. Something awful. Miss Marple nodded, her voice steady. And did he say what that something was? Marjorie's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he struck her, in an argument, that she fell, hit her head. He buried her in a place he never named. He didn't mean to, but he could never tell anyone. There was a long silence. Only the soft clack of the clock broke it. Miss Marple reached across the table and took Marjorie's hand. My dear, that was not your fault. I didn't want to believe it, she said, tears brimming. I thought perhaps he had imagined it, or that he was protecting someone. But the look in his eyes when he handed me that letter, he was already dying. He knew what was coming. Miss Marple offered her a handkerchief, then sat back, her own expression unreadable. So it was true. Eleanor Wilton had been Marjorie's mother, and Peregrine North, in all his coldness and control, had harbored a guilt so great he had painted it into permanence, framed it in pewter, and displayed it behind a veil of false pride. But then why had he been killed? A sudden thought came to her, thread not yet pulled. Miss Marple stood, excused herself briefly, and went to her sideboard. She opened the drawer, drew out the folded photograph again, and looked at it anew. Yes, there it was. In the corner of the photograph, not far behind Eleanor, stood another figure, barely in focus, but recognizable. Younger version of someone still walking Fernwood streets. Not Mr. North. Miss Marple returned to the sitting room and looked at Marjorie. Do you know who took this photograph? Marjorie peered at it, her breath catching. That's my mother. I've never seen this. Look again. In the corner. Marjorie gasped. That's Mrs. Dunthorpe. Indeed it was. Miss Marple folded the photograph with care. Then perhaps, she said, her voice low and certain, it is time I paid Mrs. Dunthorpe a visit. The game was changing. The guilt was real. But perhaps it had not been Mr. North's alone. There were still pieces to fall into place and a final mask, it seemed, yet to be removed. There were few women in Fernwood as revered and as feared as Mrs. Agatha Dunthorpe. A widow of 30 years, with a regal bearing and a tongue sharp enough to trim hedges, she had presided over the Women's Guild, organized the harvest fete for 2 decades, and maintained a house so immaculate it was whispered the postman wiped his boots twice before stepping onto the path. Miss Marple had always regarded Mrs. Dunthorpe with a kind of affectionate caution, much as one might regard a lioness resting in the sun, charming in repose, but not to be trifled with. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple, wearing her second-best hat and carrying a small jar of quince jelly as an offering of civility, made her way up the path to Dunthorpe House. The curtains were, as always, drawn with precise symmetry. A porcelain spaniel watched from the window-sill with glazed indifference. Mrs. Dunthorpe herself answered the door, her silver hair swept back into its usual imperious knot. "Miss Marple," she said, one eyebrow arching like a question mark. "I wasn't expecting callers." "No one ever does, my dear," Miss Marple replied cheerfully, holding out the jar. "But I found myself with more jelly than I could sensibly consume, and I thought perhaps you might indulge me with a cup of tea." Mrs. Dunthorpe's expression softened by degrees. Well, it would be rude to refuse quince. She stepped aside, and Miss Marple entered the front parlour, where not a single cushion was out of place. The tea service arrived shortly, delivered on a silver tray that gleamed like a mirror, and the 2 women sat beneath the ticking of a grandfather clock that measured time as though it disapproved of delay. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Dunthorpe began once the cups were poured, "I presume you haven't come simply to discuss preserves." "No," said Miss Marple kindly. "I've come to ask you about a photograph." She withdrew the old black and white print from her handbag and placed it gently on the table. "Taken at the village fete some 30 years ago. The young woman in the foreground is Eleanor Wilton." Mrs. Dunthorpe's face remained still, but her hand paused in its motion toward the teacup. "I remember her," she said after a moment. She was troubled. "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "She vanished in 1922. No record, no burial, no forwarding address. Only this image remains, and you in the background." Mrs. Dunthorpe's fingers curled slightly. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Not so long," Miss Marple replied, "for the truth to matter." Mrs. Dunthorpe sat back. And what truth would that be? That Eleanor Wilton was in love with Peregrine North, that she married him, that she bore his child, that something happened to her, a fall, an accident, or a disappearance, and that Mr. North concealed it. But perhaps he did not act alone. Mrs. Dunthorpe's expression cracked, not dramatically, but like fine china under pressure, a tightness at the corners of the eyes, a flicker of memory unbidden. "She was my cousin," she said. "First cousin. Our mothers were sisters." Eleanor was impressionable. She fancied herself an artist, dreamed of London, of gallery openings and Parisian cafes, and then came north, handsome, clever, cruel in a quiet way. Miss Marple listened, eyes steady. "I warned her," Mrs. Dunthorpe went on, "told her not to trust him, but she believed he was her way out of Fernwood. They married in secret, and for a while she was happy. She wrote me letters, pages of them. Then they stopped." She paused and took a breath. "One evening he came to my door, told me she had left, that she'd run away. Left a note," he said. "No forwarding address, no apology. Just gone." "But you didn't believe him," Miss Marple said quietly. "Number I didn't. I saw the mark on his wrist, as if she'd scratched him, and he couldn't see my eyes." "What did you do?" "I searched, quietly. I asked around, but there was nothing on record of her at any boarding house. No letters, no sightings. It was as though she had simply ceased." "And so you stayed close," Miss Marple murmured. "You watched him. You waited. Mrs. Dunthorpe nodded. He remarried. Margaret. A dull, quiet woman. I never confronted him, but I never forgave him either. And then, this year, he submitted the portrait, Miss Marple said. A painting not of Margaret, but of Eleanor. A copy, recreated from memory, hung in a pewter frame, etched with her initials. Mrs. Dunthorpe's lips tightened. It was a mockery, or confession. Another silence. Outside, a sparrow fluttered past the window, wings brushing the glass like a whisper. "Did you kill him?" Miss Marple asked, not accusingly, but as one might ask whether it had rained during the night. Mrs. Dunthorpe did not flinch. "No," she said, "though I wanted to. When I saw that portrait, when I recognized her face after all these years, I wanted to scream. But you didn't. I left the hall, went home, sat in that chair, staring at the fire, remembering. Miss Marple believed her. There was a weariness in her voice that could not be feigned. But someone did kill him, she said, and I think they did it not out of rage, but out of fear. Fear that Eleanor's memory, her identity, might finally be brought to light. Mrs. Dunthorpe looked down at her hands. Then you must look closer to him, not among his enemies, but among those who owed him everything. It was dusk when Miss Marple left Dunthorpe House. The street lamps had not yet flickered to life, and the wind had begun to stir, carrying with it the scent of distant chimney smoke and damp leaves. She walked with quiet purpose toward the green, her mind returning again and again to that simple, chilling phrase. He only copied what he destroyed. She passed the Timpson residence just as the curtains were being drawn. Bernard stood in the sitting room, speaking softly to someone out of view. Marjorie, perhaps? Miss Marple watched them for a moment, then continued on. Her path turned toward the constabulary, where Constable Hartley greeted her with a nod and led her into his office. She handed him the photograph. "And you're certain it's her?" he asked. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And so is Mrs. Dunthorpe." Hartley examined the image with a slow frown. "It puts everything in a new light." "Yes," she said, "including the likelihood that the murderer was not someone enraged by the past, but someone who needed desperately to keep it buried." Hartley set the photo down. "I'll need to question them both again," he said. "Marjorie and Bernard." Miss Marple nodded, but gently. "They've lived with shadows long enough." She left the constabulary and made her way home. The evening had deepened. A lone owl called from the treetops. Her lamp glowed warmly through the lace curtain. Inside, Miss Marple lit the fire and picked up her knitting. She worked the needles in a steady rhythm, the pattern simple and soothing. But her thoughts were not on yarn. They were on the pewter frame. On the painting was not art, but guilt. And on the final piece of the puzzle, the person who had the most to lose if Eleanor Wilton was ever truly seen again. The next morning broke with the kind of clean sunlight that made the rooftops of Fernwood look almost innocent again. But innocence, Miss Marple reflected, was so often just a question of selective memory. By 9 o'clock, she had dressed and eaten, and by past, she was at the constabulary with a short note in her handbag and a request she rarely made in the interview room. Constable Hartley, though initially bewildered, granted her the space with the mild awe that Miss Marple's quiet certainty always seemed to inspire. 2 chairs were brought in, and the fire was lit against the lingering September chill. Miss Marple sat, her back perfectly straight, the note in her lap. She'd asked for a meeting with Marjorie Blaine. Not Bernard, not the vicar, just Marjorie. And when the young woman entered, shoulders drawn inward and eyes wary, Miss Marple greeted her not with suspicion but with something far more disarming. Compassion. "Thank you for coming, my dear," she said gently. "I imagine it wasn't easy." Marjorie sat without answering. Her gloves were folded tightly in her lap, her coat still buttoned as though she hadn't meant to stay long. Miss Marple waited a moment before speaking again. "I asked you here because I believe you've been carrying something too heavy for one person." Marjorie's lip trembled. "I've told you what I knew." "Yes, you told me what Mr. North confessed in that letter. The story of Eleanor Wilton, of the accident, and of your origins. And I believe that story to be true but incomplete." Marjorie's eyes flicked upward. "Incomplete?" Miss Marple unfolded the note in her lap and handed it over. Marjorie took it, read the familiar handwriting, and grew visibly pale. He never painted her. He only copied what he destroyed. "You recognize the hand?" Miss Marple asked softly. Marjorie hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, I wrote it." "Not out of guilt," Miss Marple said, "but from pain. You believed that by bringing the portrait to the exhibition, he was desecrating her memory." Marjorie's voice was barely a whisper. "He made her a painting, but he never gave her a funeral." There was silence between them for a long moment. "Did you poison him, Marjorie?" She shook her head violently. "Number, I hated him, yes, for what he did to her, for what he made me live with. But I could never. I couldn't." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "You said Bernard didn't know about the letter." "Number, I never told him. He loved Mr. North. Saw him as some sort of mentor." "And you told no one else?" "Number," Miss Marple leaned forward. "Then who else could have known about Eleanor? About the portrait? Who could have felt their position threatened if the truth were revealed?" Marjorie stared. Blank. "I don't understand." Miss Marple sat back. "The murder wasn't committed in anger, my dear. It was committed with planning. The sugar bowl was tampered with. The poison was replaced. Mr. North poured the tea himself. No one handed it to him. The killer counted on that." Marjorie blinked, as though a veil was slowly lifting. "It wasn't to punish him," Miss Marple went on. "It was to silence him, before he could speak further." There was a knock at the door. Constable Hartley stepped in. "Miss Marple," he said, "Bernard Timpson has just arrived. He says he wants to speak to you." Marjorie stood abruptly. "No, don't bring him in." Miss Marple raised a hand. "Wait. Marjorie, sit. Let me explain something to you. Then we'll decide what must be done." Reluctantly, the girl sat again. Her face was pale, but there was something fierce behind her eyes now. A flame, small but steady. "Mr. North told you everything," Miss Marple said. "He gave you that letter in a moment of genuine reckoning. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was age. But he was preparing to make it public. The portrait, the frame, and the certificate, he was laying the path for revelation. But someone got ahead of him." Marjorie shook her head. "Bernard didn't even know about the frame." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But he saw you after you read the letter. He saw what it did to you. He asked what was wrong. You told him nothing. But he is not a foolish man, Marjorie. He saw your pain, and he guessed. The young woman's breathing quickened. He would have gone to Mr. North. And Mr. North, perhaps arrogantly, may have confirmed his suspicions. That you were Eleanor's daughter, that you were illegitimate, that his legacy, and perhaps Bernard's future by association, would be stained." "No," Marjorie whispered. Miss Marple's voice did not rise. It never needed to. "Bernard loved you, but he also feared scandal. His business relies on trust, on appearances. And what he saw was not just your grief, but a threat, a truth that could undo everything he'd worked toward." Marjorie stared at her, a tear slipping down one cheek. Number Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice like silk over steel. "He didn't do it out of hatred. He did it because he believed it was the only way to protect you, and himself." The door opened behind them. "Marjorie?" Bernard stood there, his coat in hand, his tie slightly askew. When he saw the expression on her face frozen, torn between realization and despair, He stepped forward. "What's going on?" Marjorie rose, voice trembling. "Tell me the truth, Bernard." He stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then he said, "I don't know what she's told you, but tell me," Marjorie said again, louder now. His eyes darted to Miss Marple, then to Hartley behind the door. "I saw how you looked at me," Marjorie said, voice rising. "After I read that letter, you asked, but I didn't answer. And you went to him, didn't you? You confronted him." Bernard took a breath, but there was no use in it. "I did, and he confirmed it." A nod. "So you poisoned him?" He hesitated. "Then I put it in the sugar bowl," he said, the words barely audible. "I didn't know if he'd use it that day, but I had to make sure. Before he told anyone else." Hartley stepped forward. Mr. Timpson Barnard raised a hand. "I won't run. There's no point." He turned to Marjorie. "I loved you. I still do. I didn't want the world to see you as the daughter of a scandal. I thought if I stopped him, you could be free of all of it." Marjorie shook her head. "You took away the one man who ever tried to tell me the truth." And then, without another word, she left the room. Constable Hartley placed a gentle but firm hand on Bernard's shoulder. Miss Marple, sitting very still, closed her notebook slowly. Outside, the wind picked up. The village green swayed gently in the light. In the sky above Fernwood, clouds were shifting, and so were secrets. The day after Bernard Timpson's quiet confession, Fernwood moved as if caught between two worlds, the visible surface of routines and courtesies, and the barely concealed thrum of unrest rippling underneath. Church bells rang on schedule, the post was delivered promptly, and yet in every doorway and at every corner, eyes lingered longer, voices softened more quickly, and polite conversation carried a sharper undertone. At the corner tea shop, Mrs. Pickering whispered to the grocer's wife that it had been a matter of pride, not poison. Across the green, Edna from the laundry muttered that Bernard did what any man might to protect a lady's name. No one said the word murder out loud. Not quite, but the village knew. It always did. Miss Marple had remained largely at home that morning, answering the occasional knock from neighbors bearing baskets and opinions, listening more than speaking. She sat in her parlor with her lacework in her lap, her mind drifting not to Bernard or Marjorie, but to Eleanor Wilton, forgotten for decades, reduced to whispers and unmarked years, yet still somehow at the center of everything. Around noon, a soft tap came at her door. She opened it to find Marjorie standing there, hatless, coatless, her face bare of anything but exhaustion. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Miss Marple stepped aside. "Then you're exactly where you should be." Inside, tea was poured, silence was allowed, and the warmth of the fire settled between them like a quilt. "I thought I'd feel something," Marjorie said after a while. "Relief, rage. I don't know, but all I feel is empty." "That's grief," Miss Marple said gently. "Not just for Bernard or for your mother, but for everything you never had the chance to understand until now." Marjorie's fingers curled around the teacup. "Do you believe him?" "I do," Miss Marple said softly. "I believe he thought he was protecting you. But love, when it becomes possessive, can be terribly destructive, especially when it fears the truth." Marjorie looked toward the hearth, where the fire crackled softly. "He said he didn't know if Mr. North would use the sugar that day. It wasn't certain." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but he was willing to let it be. That uncertainty placing the burden on fate is its own kind of guilt." "I didn't know I was hers," Marjorie whispered. "Eleanor, my mother, I've always felt adrift, like I didn't belong in the story I was born into." Miss Marple reached forward and gently placed her hand over Marjorie's. "You do now." They sat like that for a while, two women bound not by blood, but by understanding. Later that day, the constable returned the photograph. Hartley, solemn but respectful, handed it over along with a quiet observation. No sign of Eleanor Wilton's grave. No record, not even in the neighbouring counties. Miss Marple accepted this with a small nod. Then I suspect we shall never find it. She was never meant to be found. No, Miss Marple said, but she has been remembered. He hesitated, then added, Marjorie won't be pressing charges. She wouldn't, Miss Marple replied. Not out of forgiveness, but because punishment in a village like Fernwood rarely takes the form of prison walls. Hartley nodded and took his leave. That evening, Miss Marple paid one final visit. Mrs. Dunthorpe was seated in her front parlour, knitting the cuff of a child's mitten. She looked up as Miss Marple entered and gave a nod that spoke volumes of gratitude, of weariness, and of relief. Eleanor would have liked you, she said. I'm not so sure, Miss Marple replied. She had a difficult life, and I suspect she trusted no one in the end. Mrs. Dunthorpe stared into the fire. I should have looked harder, asked more questions. You did what you could, Miss Marple said. And now, after all this time, the truth has surfaced. It won't change the past, but it may reshape the future. I've made arrangements, Mrs. Dunthorpe said. A headstone, it won't say much. Just her name, and a year. But it will be there, in the churchyard. Miss Marple's smile was small, but it glowed with warmth. That's all that matters. Outside, the moon rose, casting long shadows across the tidy gardens and clipped hedgerows. The village of Fernwood, so proud of its order, had revealed its undercurrents. Once more, human frailties, secret loves, and the consequences of silence. The next morning, the portrait of Eleanor Wilton was removed from the evidence room. At Marjorie's request, it was not destroyed, but stored in the attic of Dunthorpe House, beneath dust covers and memories, where it would rest not as a relic of guilt, but as a symbol of what was lost and found. The pewter frame, however, was melted down by the blacksmith at the edge of town. Quietly, without ceremony. Marjorie left Fernwood a week later. No dramatic farewell, no announcements. Just a short letter left with Mrs. Chudley, thanking the village for its hospitality and expressing the wish to begin anew. It was said she boarded a train to the coast, to a small cottage near Lyme Regis, once owned by her grandmother. Bernard Timpson remained in custody until his solicitor negotiated a quiet agreement. In time, he disappeared from public view on business ties. No return to Fernwood, only a vague rumor that he'd found work abroad. And Miss Marple, she remained where she always had been, quietly seated beneath her lace curtains, a pot of tea at her elbow, a volume of poetry on the side table, and the knowledge that the truth, however painful, always had a way of arriving. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. She wrote one final line in her diary beneath the date. Justice is not always swift, but it does come, even if it arrives in the shape of a girl with no name, a portrait in a heavy frame and the silence between two generations. Outside her window, autumn had begun to paint the village in its softer shades. The leaves whispered in the breeze, and the church bell rang not in mourning, but in peace. Fernwood, for now, could rest, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, returned to her knitting.